Spider, spider, burning bright.
Phew, as if.
In the forests of the night.
Oh, maybe you should stop tangling with A-listers.
What immortal hand or eye
So much for that idea. Just give up.
could frame thy fearful symmetry?
In 1987, Marvel's stable of Spider-Man titles was chugging along nicely, as The Amazing, Peter Parker the Spectacular, and Web of formed a holy trinity of books. None of them had had a regular creative team for a while, but nonetheless they were enjoyable reads. The Amazing Spider-Man had seen Spidey dealing with gang warfare, Mary Jane accepting Pete's proposal, and Ned Leeds being revealed to be the Hobgoblin. Or was he? Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man continued to have the most street-level approach of the three, although nowhere near the levels shown during the Black Cat, Cloak and Dagger and Answer period that culminated in issue 100. And Web of Spider-Man had its traditional lighter tone. All three had crossed over the previous year with the Missing in Action storyline, but now they were going to cross over again for arguably the best-known Spider-Man story ever, the other contender for that title being The Night Gwen Stacy Died. The original plan wasn't for it to cross over all three titles. Instead, it was going to run for 6 months in Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man. But, no, hold on, that wasn't the original plan at all. The writer of the story, J.M. DeMatteis, had originally conceived of it as the basis for a Wonder Man limited series, where Simon Williams would be the hero crawling free from his own grave. That proposal was turned down by Tom DeFalco, but J.M. didn't abandon the idea and instead repurposed it as a Batman storyline, which he pitched to DC when he started working with them. Again, it was rejected, but third time's the charm, and when he tweaked it again and then put it to the then editor of the Spider-Man titles, Jim Owsley, Jim gave it the green light. It's odd that a storyline that went on to be so highly regarded, so famous, was such a struggle to get published. And this isn't just some Joe Schmo like you or me sending in a proposal. This was a respected writer that had already been in the business for nearly a decade. We can just be grateful that he persisted. So the hero would be Spider-Man and not Batman, and instead of the Joker, the villain would be Kraven the Hunter. In many ways, Kraven was perfect for this storyline. It could have featured a D-list villain, or even a brand new character, but an established adversary would naturally lend it more weight. However, the antagonist in this tale was not going to survive, so surely you couldn't use a popular villain that other writers were bound to want to use. In the 1980s, Kraven just wasn't that kind of character. Whether it was down to the limiting concept of Russian jungle boy always wants to hunt, or his slightly silly appearance, Kraven had fallen a long way from his early popularity. We don't see it now. We think he was always popular, but that is largely down to this storyline. But the truth is, he was hardly used at all in the years leading up to it. He hadn't had more than the very occasional single-issue storyline in The Amazing Spider-Man for 15 years. Characters that had managed at least a 2-issue storyline in that time included such luminaries as the Hitman, the Rocket Racer, and Stegron. He hadn't appeared at all in Web of Spider-Man and had just one measly appearance in the previous 11 years of Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man. An ensemble of villains was a popular feature on several Amazing Spider-Man covers. From issue 141 in 1975 to issue 181 in 1978, we kept seeing Spidey's greatest enemies, most dangerous foes, lunging at him or watching over him. And poor Sergei. Here was a well-known but underused villain. Would it really cause any problems to kill him off? I tell you what, let's have a look at his most recent appearance in a Spider-Man book, and that was in issue 65 of Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man, from 5 years previously. Bill Mantlow's the writer for this one, with artwork provided by Bob Hall and Jim Mooney. Let's see if we can work out why he was no longer taken seriously. It shouldn't take long. Well, you may not be impressed with him, but these mugs certainly seem to be. They are playing what they call some kind of game in a pretend city. The game basically consists of Kraven catching them and beating them up. This, we are told, is because he has been in prison cells for so long. That explains his absence from the comics. That his jungle senses have become dulled, and he needs to sharpen them again if he is to once more hunt. And he needs to hunt again, as he explains to his girlfriend Calypso, who's been there all the time playing a kind of a hypnotic rhythmic beat on her drum. He has to hunt because he was defeated by Spider-Man, and he now has to humiliate Spider-Man to regain his honour. Him and his bloody honour. Speaking of Spider-Man, well, Peter Parker anyway, he is currently an assistant teacher as well as a student at Empire State University. He's got an appointment with Dr. Sloan, who explains that he's worried about Peter's sagging grades and his lack of attention in class. So he thinks that it's the assistant teachership that's a distraction for him. So he says that for the time being at least, he's going to have to stop being an assistant teacher. This is bad news for Peter because that brings in some money that he needs to help pay Aunt May's medical bills. It's funny how at this point in the history of Spider-Man comics that the different titles focused on different aspects of Peter Parker's life. Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, did tend to focus on his life at Empire State University and the other students there and his studies. The Amazing Spider-Man focused more on the Daily Bugle and that part of his cast of characters. Whereas Marvel Team Up, it was rare to see him without his Spider-Man mask on at all in that comic. As is often the case when Peter is having a stressful time, a spot of web swinging helps to relieve the tension. Unfortunately for him, Kraven is out hunting. Not only that, but Calypso's drum beats not only make it hard for Spidey to think, but it dulls his spider sense, leaving him open to an attack. Despite this, he does well in avoiding a war axe, a net, and some darts before he comes face to face with the man who he had already worked out was behind all this. And then we are treated to the usual kind of interaction between these two characters. Spidey taking the mickey out of Kraven, Kraven responding in a more pompous manner, banging on about honour. At one point he says that although Spider-Man has been out of his sight, he has not been out of his mind, and he spent long hours in prison thinking about how he could defeat him. Well, he says that here, but Kraven's Last Hunt, of course, shows us what that actually looks like when he is purely focused on defeating Spider-Man. Then Spidey kind of summarises their entire history when he says, you start these fights, you get beat, and then you come whining back for a rematch. That just about sums it up. We have a bit more fighting on the rooftops until Spidey whips Calypso's drum away from her. With that and the rhythmic beat gone, even Calypso knows that Spidey's spider sense is going to return. I've said before about the inconsistency throughout the entirety of Spider-Man's history, whereby do other people know he has a spider sense or not? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. And here, even Calypso knows about it. Kraven reckons he'll still triumph, even though, as he says, Spider-Man's cowardly spider sense has returned. Yeah, his cowardly spider sense and his cowardly super strength. Sadly for Kraven, he's completely wrong, and the tide of battle turns decisively in Spider-Man's favour. Calypso hates seeing her beloved beaten like this, although interestingly, she doesn't talk about him being driven by honour. Instead, she talks about his ego. She wants to help him, and so she shoots Spider-Man with a drugged dart. Kraven is unaware of her assistance, and he thinks it's just his innate superiority that's helped him turn the tide of battle. That is, until he starts to think that things are just too easy. He then sees the tiny dart in Spider-Man's leg, and he realises what she's done. And the pair of them then argue, with Calypso saying, "But you've beaten him, isn't that what matters?" And him saying, "No, actually, she has shamed him by helping him." Meanwhile, Spidey is so off his head on drugs that, still wearing the Anuak trophy mask that Calypso placed on him, he leaps right off the side of the building. Spidey is now clinging onto a flagpole and fighting with the flag, and Kraven's honour forces him to try to rescue the wallcrawler. His intentions, though, are misunderstood, and Spidey fights him before then falling to land eventually on the street below, where such ordinary objects as buses and lampposts take on crazy, nightmarish features. Kraven now joins him on the pavement, and he thinks that if he can subdue Spider-Man before he harms himself, that will be the ultimate test of his hunter's skills. Of course, it doesn't work out that way, and it's only when a police car slams into Spider-Man that the webhead is finally crawling at Kraven's feet. The police car hitting Spidey was just an accident, so they say, and now they have their weapons trained on Kraven. Calypso can see all of this unfolding, so she thinks, right, I'm going to put an end to this, and she launches a spear at Spider-Man. Kraven, however, plucks it from the air, claiming that had it found its mark, it would have robbed him of his dignity. She says she only did it to save his life, in which case why not throw it at one of the police officers? Anyway, Kraven says, what worth is there to life without honour? Honour, honour, honour. Then it seems the love affair is over, as Kraven says, how can she love a failure, and how can he love a woman who cannot understand the meaning of honour or dignity? As Kraven is led off by the police, Spider-Man recovers and swings off, thinking, I'll hang his hide out to dry if he ever tries to dump on me again. Well, this is your typical Kraven the Hunter storyline. Kraven obsessed with defeating or at least capturing Spider-Man, whilst also being driven in everything he does by honour, and of course ultimately failing and being led away by the boys in blue. There are plenty of African weapons being used, and also lots of banter between him and his web-headed nemesis. Nothing out of the ordinary in that tale, and it's a good example of the narrow scope that Kraven the Hunter storylines had. Although Kraven was the main antagonist in the story sometimes referred to as Fearful Symmetry, he wasn't the only one. Writers have a tendency to give more attention to their own creations than other people normally would, so it should come as no surprise to learn that Vermin was created by James DeMatteis when he was working on Captain America. Not only that, but the artist on the title at that time was, you guessed it didn't you, Mike Zeck. Issue 272 was that character's debut, but his most recent appearance was in... oh my god, how is this ever approved by editorial? Marvel Team Up, issue 128. They could have done anything with this cover, anything, but they chose this. Kerry Gamble and Mike Esposito are the art team on this one, and I'm sure I don't need to tell you who the writer was. It was James DeMatteis. I thought it was obvious. Peter is at a street fair with a couple of friends from university, but despite the fairground-like atmosphere, he's very down in the dumps, as one of them actually comments to him when she says, Peter, you're walking around like the sword of Damascus is hanging over your head. Sword of Damascus? I assume she means the sword of Damocles. Peter, being a very polite chap, doesn't correct her, but he tells us that the reason he's down is because he's worried about the Black Cat, who's currently in hospital after that run-in with Dr. Octopus during that great storyline leading up to issue 100 of Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man. Peter isn't the only off-duty superhero there, because Steve Rogers is there with his girlfriend Bernie. And yes, that is a sketch pad that Steve is holding. It's just so odd that there was this period where Steve Rogers earned a living as an illustrator. It's weird. At that point, a number of rats appear. Hold on a moment. Rats, James DeMatteis, it can only mean one thing. Vermin. Soon, Vermin's hand in all this is confirmed, as he appears, not just accompanied by rats, but also with some rabid dogs. Steve sees Peter taking pictures, and he says, Parker's doing his job, and it's time that I did mine. He's not going to get his sketch pad out again, is he? Before you know it, Peter and Steve have both made their excuses, and they both emerge after a quick change from cubicles in the men's toilets. Cap is familiar with Vermin, having tangled with him only recently, and it won't surprise you to hear that the two heroes work together to defeat him this time, with Cap taking on the dogs and Spidey taking on the rats. Their rather contrived teamwork helps to overcome their four-legged foes, but during the melee, Vermin has escaped. And he's quite happy with that, because all he came for was to steal and eat food. He's had his fill, so he's now happy to leave. Now we have something of a romantic interlude. Well, I say romantic. In reality, Both of our main stars come close to cheating on their girlfriends. Cap with S.H.I.E.L.D. agent Gail Runlighter, and Peter with the female friend he was at the fair with, Mia, who herself has a boyfriend, Roger. We're told that these two are friends of Peter's from university, but I don't recall them at all. Anyway, a news bulletin stops him from making a terrible mistake. The reporter says that a rat-like beast has barricaded himself inside a grocery store, and Peter shouts out, "Vermin!" No, I don't like the press either, Pete. But indeed, Vermin has barricaded himself inside a grocery store. Makes a change from a bank, I suppose. An officer at the scene tells Spidey that Vermin nearly killed the manager and some customers before they got out. Every time the police, try to get in there, they're driven back by those rats and dogs. With Cap on the scene as well, as Spidey says they must listen to the same radio station, they enter the grocery store and the inevitable fight ensues. After an initial tussle, Cap says to Spidey, "Grab him!" and Spidey says, "You don't have to tell me twice," but then doesn't grab him, choosing instead to prat around by jumping in the air. There's a lot of talk in this, especially from Spidey's banter, about what an absolutely awful, terrible person Vermin is, like on the inside. In Kraven's Last Hunt, he was dealt with a lot more sympathetically, and even in this, he attacked some people in that grocery store, but all he wants is some food. Very judgmental, Spidey. Vermin is certainly giving them both the runaround. Spidey is quickly thrown off, and Cap is struggling. We are given something of an explanation, as Cap thinks, "My fighting is as sloppy as Spider-Man's," and that's because we're both reacting more from our guts than our heads. Just being around Vermin seems to trigger some primal, animalistic response. Not sure I buy that. Cap is unconscious, and just as Vermin is about to behead him, seriously, there is a thwip, and that good old saviour webline stops him. Vermin then orders the dogs and rats to attack, before realising that they've deserted him. And Cap points out that they know when to retreat. So Vermin is defeated, and our heroes part company. The only rats I see are two love rats.
Is that it? It seemed a bit shorter than usual.
No, that's it.
Really?
Yeah, all done. Just a couple of pages of ads.
That's more than a couple.
Well, letters page 2.
What else is there?
Nothing.
There is. There's clearly something else there that isn't a letters page or adverts.
Oh, okay. Apparently Marvel was so chuffed with this god-awful cover that they devoted a whole 6 pages of the comic to it. We have the story of its creation by the photographer Elliot R. Brown, who talks about it as though he's actually proud of this photographic crime. And no less than 7 alternate shots. What it does show us is that the cover could have been even worse. Now please, can I get rid of this and read Kraven's Last Hunt?
From looking at those 2 comics alone, we can see that the shifting tone of storytelling between those and Kraven's Last Hunt is stark. That was one of the reasons why some people doubted whether this kind of storyline would work in a comic with a famously wisecracking lead. But the comic book landscape was changing. Just the previous year, Frank Miller had brought us not just 1, but 2 dark and gritty storylines, with The Dark Knight Returns and the Born Again story in Daredevil. Later that same year, 1986, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons released their deconstructionist masterpiece, Watchmen. With those stories proving to be so popular, why shouldn't Spidey have a go? Besides, I think it's a trifle unfair to say that just because old Webhead has a habit of cracking wise, these stories never had a darker side to them. After all, in the past, there were some famously downbeat tales, such as The Night Gwen Stacy Died, the Drugs storyline, and numerous run-ins with New York's criminal underworld. Besides, does this look fun to you? Or this? Or this? Or this? Or this? The covers and interior art are, of course, by Mike Zeck, a man who has passed into legend thanks in the main to his work on this story. He was also the main artist on the original Secret Wars, but other than that, his only significant runs were on Master of Kung Fu and, more famously, Captain America. You really would have thought that someone with his talent would have been tied down to some more high-profile titles, much like John Buscema, John Byrne and John Romita Jr. were. Maybe he's got the wrong first name. What a cover though. One of two from this story that I would say are among the greatest ever. No prizes for guessing what the other one is. Mike was so on board with this story that he got to work on all 6 covers straight away, and actually completed them before he produced any interior art. With this cover, he managed to sum up the tone of the entire series. On the face of it, it's nothing special. The hero is trapped under a net with a gun pointing at him. But it's those dark but strong colours, the rain lashing down, as it did for most of the story, and Spidey's panicked pose as he stands in the rooftop puddles. Would it have looked so effective if Spidey was in his red and blues? Hard to say, but the black costume certainly suits the mood. Writer J.M. DeMatteis had experience of writing Spider-Man when he was the regular scripter on Marvel Team Up a couple of years before, and he would go on to be the lead writer on the Spectacular Spider-Man, as well as a contributor to other Spider titles. Wallcrawler aside, J.M. has written for a whole slew of characters across 6 decades, as well as writing for TV, mainly animated series. Okay then, let's do it. Let's immerse ourselves in Kraven's Last Hunt. This is another one of those comics, along with Secret Wars and Excalibur, The Sword is Drawn, that I've read so many times that I can tell you exactly how it begins before I even open it. We have pictures of Kraven in his mansion house. He's naked and he emulates a panther at one point, and then he stands upright in front of some big stuffed ape type creature. One of them gets their head knocked off. I don't mean Kraven, I mean one of the animals. I don't know, the panther maybe? Not sure. But yeah, an absolutely great beginning. And there you go. It begins with arguably the best known image of Kraven since those early cover appearances. And rather than the usual cliched stuff of him talking about his plans maybe, or ranting and raving about how Spider-Man has thwarted him time and time again, instead, while we spend this time with Kraven, his thoughts are very introspective. We are told how he thinks and feels about himself as Kraven the Hunter, which is all very much bravado and hyperbole, and there you go, it was the ape that lost its head. And we learn how he feels about himself as Sergei Kravenov, the man, an old man as he describes himself. He's more reflective, disappointed with the world around him. He finds more honour and more meaning in the false world of Kraven the Hunter than he does in how the real world has developed and changed as he has grown older. He's now in his 70s and aware of his mortality. He has a coffin there, and inside that is a spare Spider-Man suit. And Kraven thinks that he will die soon, Kraven. He thinks that he must die soon, but not yet. We then leave Kraven's mansion and head to what looks like one of the rougher parts of town, where a group of hoodlums are mourning the loss of one of their own. We all know who's dead, don't we? Probably one of the most famous people for being dead in the whole of comic history, Joe Face. And I suppose now is a good time to point out those panels that intercut this story. In the issue after this one, it was of a rat kind of dancing on the grave before a spider emerges at the end. The issue after that, it was lots and lots of spiders on that grave before, well, this issue is the gravedigger, who progressively throughout the issue gets deeper and deeper into the grave that he's digging. After that brief diversion, we're back with Joe Face, and he has a visitor. Spidey is there literally to pay his respects. Of course, the hoods run away from him, but he says they're scared, running from someone who doesn't even exist. And he's right, he doesn't exist. Spider-Man doesn't exist. That isn't Spider-Man. That's Peter Parker wearing the Spider-Man suit. The suit doesn't change him. He's still the same person underneath it. And he confirms that later on when he says, "Oh sure, it'd be great if putting on a costume could miraculously change the person underneath. But it can't. I'm not Spider-Man." And it's interesting to compare Peter's attitude to the fact that he does look like two very different entities in and out of costume, but he knows he's the same person, to Kraven, who actually looks the same regardless of what he wears. Even if he's wearing his slightly hammy outfit, he looks the same, but
He has the persona of Kraven the Hunter, and in the background there is Kraven the man. He's just Peter Parker, and there he is, Peter Parker, paying his last respects. And as he says, I guess I do care. And again, another difference between the two characters is that Peter does care about everyone around him. In his world, Peter always comes last. Whereas Sergei, he cares very much about his own self-worth, about how the world has affected him, and about he connects or doesn't connect to it. After Spidey gets home, we see for the first time that little line about yesterday Ned Leeds, now Joe Face, tomorrow Aunt May, Mary Jane, me. And then he too recognises, I am going to die, but not yet. Peter awakes from a nightmare, but it isn't the nightmare that we have just seen of Kraven feasting on live spiders, although it does sound like there are similarities there, as he says that there were things crawling all over him. As Kraven, in his frenzy, keeps on repeating, tonight, tonight. We've seen it before and we'll see it again. Peter web swinging to relieve tension. Here, when he encounters Kraven, there are a lot of similarities to their previous encounter, but also some very significant differences. First of all, of course, there's the fact that whilst he's web swinging, Kraven is out hunting. What a great picture of Kraven. Someone please make me a poster of that. And here we see for the first time another characteristic of this storyline, which is the alternating thoughts from the same character. The first lot we see are from Peter. So the yellow boxes, his head, the red boxes, his heart, the red boxes, his deepest, most honest fears, and the yellow boxes, him trying to rationalise these things away so that he can stay on top of things, so that he can tread water. As much as I could picture those initial images from this comic, I could also have sworn blind that it began with the Spider poem, but it didn't. In fact, we get it here now, just over halfway through for the very first time. It's while this is being recounted, by Kraven presumably, because his thoughts are all in lowercase in this storyline. The Spider-Man is hit with a drugged dart. We've already seen how when Kraven was beating Spider-Man before, after being drugged, it was dishonourable. Now, what? It doesn't matter? Maybe because Kraven himself shot the dart at him? Or maybe it does matter, but that is no longer the priority. We've got some great panels here showing the ghost of Joe Face and Kraven, and the oppressive feel of them is really helped by this thick, heavy, dark rain and the light from the advertising lamp cutting through that murk. As before, we have a fight on the rooftop, and as before, Kraven uses a net, but this time against a drugged Spider-Man, he has more success with it. As Spider-Man struggles against the netting, Kraven advances on him and takes off a rifle from his back. Just that action is so chilling. It's not an axe or a spear or any of the other jungle or African themed weapons he's used in the past. He has a rifle slung over his shoulder, and as he approaches Spider-Man, without saying anything, he casually takes it off. Spider-Man knows the comic cliches just as well as we do, and he trots them out, but Sergei responds with just 4 words. Honour will be restored. Spidey thinks, this isn't the Kraven I know. Amen to that. Then we see the alternating thought approach and the Ned Leeds soliloquy, if you like, mesh together with devastating effect. As Spidey thinks he's yesterday Ned Leeds, out today Joe Face, of tomorrow his Aunt May, Mary Jane. Bloody hell, it's powerful. We finish off with Spidey being buried and Kraven paying his respects. But is he sad? Is he happy? Is he sad at the passing of a great foe? Happy at the beginning of a new phase in his life? Or happy at a victory long dreamed of? Whichever it is, we aren't told his thoughts. And again, what fantastic artwork from Mike Zeck. And we finish with images of the grave being filled. Crikey, I am emotionally shattered. What an incredible story, an incredible start to the storyline. If you compare the depth of the storytelling here to their previous encounter, or for that matter, pretty much any other encounter in any story, it's just incredible. Great, great work. And it doesn't stop there, of course. The story continues in Amazing Spider-Man issue 293, which also has a great cover. Are any of them not great? And if there were any doubts as to the fate of Spider-Man from the end of the previous issue, they're quickly dispelled with an image of that now famous gravestone. Kraven is standing over it, wearing the Spider-Man suit. Still, clearly, there are mixed emotions, but still, we aren't let into his head. We aren't told what he's thinking. And now, our second antagonist joins the fray, with a scene straight out of a horror movie, as he drags and grabs a woman down into the sewers. From that female victim, we join a female who strives to never be a victim, MJ. This is an element of the story that J.M. DeMatteis had to tweak because Peter and MJ had only recently got married, and when he first outlined the story, they weren't married. Here, MJ has packed up the stuff in her apartment, ready to move in with Peter. She too has the two conflicting trains of thought. The more emotional, gut instinct side is telling her that Peter is dead because he was due to meet her hours ago and there's no sign of him. But again, there is the more rational side trying to explain away all of those fears. And as her fears become more dominant, she takes out her frustrations on a rat. When we next catch up with Kraven, he's wandering the rooftops in Spidey's outfit. And without directly lying to us, he gives us the impression that Spider-Man is truly dead. He says the spider lies in a grave, blasted into oblivion by my hand. But he says it isn't enough just to destroy him. He has to prove that he is superior to Spider-Man. And this is the crux of the storyline, really. J.M. DeMatteis' idea wasn't that Kraven would become Spider-Man. It's that he would become what he perceived Spider-Man to be. He didn't understand the man beneath the costume. He only understood the costume and how that costume affected his life. Spider-Man was always beating him up, thwarting his plans. So that is what he thinks Spider-Man is all about. And that's why he takes that more violent approach when he deals with villains. Speaking of villains, Vermin too, after seeing a picture of Spider-Man in the paper, wants to prove that he is better than Spidey, to teach him a lesson after their previous encounter. But Vermin finds a lot of comfort hiding in the sewers, and it's going to take a lot of courage for him to leave them. A large part of this issue focuses on the next part of Kraven's plan, and there's a lot of odd stuff here. From Kraven drinking out of a bowl, to a giant spider monster attacking and overwhelming him. Clearly the obsession with Spider-Man didn't die when Spidey was put in the grave. As for Vermin, there's a nice little segue between him and Mary Jane, where he, whilst he's cowering in the sewer, can hear footsteps above, and we see that they are Mary Jane's footsteps as she's out searching the streets for Peter. And how typical of MJ. She doesn't sit at home. She isn't the damsel in distress type. Her husband, her superhero husband, has gone missing, so she goes out looking for him. Unfortunately, in walking the streets, she has attracted some unwanted attention. Of course, she deals with it in a very MJ way, but that doesn't help the situation. Soon, she's being pursued by the two guys. But it's just as they have her against a wall that she realises that her problems are over and theirs are just beginning. And this is where we see that Kraven really doesn't get Spidey at all. Okay, MJ is married to Peter, but nonetheless, she can tell, despite him being covered top to toe in that fantastic suit, that it isn't him. Okay, there's no banter, no witty repartee, but it's the violence that really gives the game away. How many times have we seen Spidey hold back because he knows the person he's attacking isn't superpowered, they're a normal person? Time and time again, he said it. Clearly here, Kraven is not holding back. And he only stops when a shocked MJ shouts for him to stop. And now we see two juxtaposed panels. One is Kraven leaving the scene and thinking, I am the Spider. The other is MJ watching him leave and knowing that wasn't Peter. Then Vermin finally plucks up the courage to leave the sewers and to make it onto the cover of Peter Parker, the Spectacular Spider-Man, issue 131. For some reason that I can't explain, the Vermin covers, there are two of them for this storyline, are my least favourite. I really don't know why, and they're still good. I still appreciate the work that's gone into them, but I don't know, that they are the weakest of the six. In this issue, we continue to see how the main players are getting on in a world without Spider-Man and get more of an insight into their psyches. Spider-Man has now been missing 2 weeks, and during his absence, New York has acquired its own cannibal serial killer. We know that it's Vermin, and we see him claim his 6th victim. During this issue, there are references from Vermin to his previous life. He talks about what he was before, although he doesn't really know what he was before. There are hints at possible child abuse that was inflicted on him when he was younger, and actually that is explicitly confirmed a few years later in the Child Within storyline, also written by J.M. DeMatteis. The only other clue we have to his life before he became what he is now is that there is a real connection. He really identifies with the black female police officer that shoots him. And how's MJ doing? Well, actually, this issue gives us a really interesting insight into her marriage to Peter, even though he's not present. And actually, we get the insight because he isn't present, because it really highlights both of their situation, I suppose, but especially Mary Jane Watson's. Because who can she talk to in the whole world about the fact that Peter has gone missing and she thinks it's because he's Spider-Man and something terrible has happened? There is no one. There is nobody else that is in on that secret. No one that doesn't have special powers or wear a strange suit anyway. But she feels she needs to talk to someone. So, out of desperation, she visits Joe Robertson. It has been hinted over the years that Joe Robertson knows that Peter is Spider-Man, or at least suspects it. So I guess it does make sense that if there was someone, anyone you could talk to about this situation, it would be Joe Robertson, because he is the closest thing there is to a third person that's in on the secret. But he isn't in on the secret. And as a result, quite tragically, Mary Jane leaves without unburdening herself. And Kraven? Well, he is loving his new life as the Spider. He believes he has a unique view of the world through Spider-Man's eyes and being seen by the world as Spider-Man. He is very happy that he's taken Spider-Man's role, but he feels there is one final test to make his victory complete. And so he plots to hunt, to capture and defeat Vermin, someone who Spider-Man couldn't defeat alone, and who Kraven says Spider-Man could never defeat alone. He finds Vermin, and, oh, by the way, awesome picture. And after a brutal fight, whilst he's pounding Vermin into unconsciousness, he thinks of his father, his mother, and his honour. So what we have here, by the way, another great picture. What we have here is not just Kraven finalising his victory over Spider-Man, but he is laying ghosts to rest. Ghosts that have haunted him his entire life. And as we reach the halfway point in the tale, the baddie, the villain, is victorious. Completely and undeniably victorious. In his eyes. He had his plans, his schemes, he's carried them all out, and they have all been successful. And the issue ends with his words, up from the depths triumphant. Almost. Because in this issue, those progressive panels, the ones that in issue 1 showed the gravedigger digging the grave, in this issue showed spiders on the grave. They multiply and grow in number throughout the issue, until at the very end we have a small but totally awesome panel. It isn't just the image of Spider-Man's hand emerging from the grave that's awesome, but also the fact that it's actually he who has the last words of the issue. From his literal and metaphorical lowest point in the story, he begins to rise. And those last words, the dominant thought in his mind, the driving force that pushes his body on, is the name of the woman that some editors decided he should never have settled down with because it restricted his storytelling potential.
Wow. In Britain in the 1980s, monthly comics for Marvel were just that. Comics that were shipped over from America en masse once a month. Web of Spider-Man wasn't released one week, with Amazing Spider-Man following the next week, and Peter Parker the Spectacular Spider-Man the week after that, as was the case in America. Instead, every title for the entire month hit the shelves at the same time. That meant that there was one glorious day each month when an entire shelf in the newsagent was taken up by crisp, fresh Marvel comics. They were all there, side by side. The Amazing Spider-Man, the Incredible Hulk, Thor, the X-Men, the Avengers. But with each passing day, those titles dwindled, until at the end of the month, you were left with a direct choice between Kickers Inc. and the Get Along Gang. So when I bought this storyline, as it was released, it meant that I devoured the first 3 parts in one sitting, and then had to wait a whole month for the story to conclude. Was it worth the wait? Hell yeah.